When they were children, they witnessed their family members wounded physically, scarred mentally, and some sealed away inside a coffin upon returning from the Vietnam War, a conflict that dragged on until 1975. They witnessed how events a world away could impact their everyday lives during the 1973 oil crisis and the 1979 energy crisis. When they entered into their teens in the 1980s, they watched as newly elected Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher ushered in the rise of conservatism. During that same period, the drug problem in the US transformed into the official war on drugs that raged throughout the 1980s. Finally, in their 20s, they experienced two events that may have left the most profound impact of all. First was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the crumbling of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War. Remember, there was a time when everyone just assumed that the Cold War, this stalemate between the US and the Soviets, would last forever. Until it didn't. And second, by the end of their 20s, they saw the mainstream introduction of the internet. In all, their formative years were filled with events that challenged their ethics, made them feel powerless and insecure, and proved to them that the world could change instantly and without warning. Combine all of that with the fact that the 2009 financial collapse happened during their prime income-earning years, and I think you can understand why this generation might feel somewhat jaded and cynical. It's the same generation that by the late 2020s will begin their rise to power by assuming leadership roles throughout the world's business, military, and government institutions. This is the future of Generation X. Hello and welcome to Life in 2030, a podcast produced by QuantumRun.com that focuses on the trends and innovations that will shape your world over the next 2 decades. My name's David, and I'm your host. In this season, we're exploring the impact our generation will have on shaping the future of humanity. To that end, myself and a special guest will use this episode to explore how the often neglected Generation X will reshape our future world. We'll take a look at what makes this generation tick and the future trends they'll be expected to lead. So let's kick things off with the basics, the numbers. Born between 1965 and 1979, Gen Xers number around 50 million, or just over 15% of the US population as of 2016. Globally, Gen Xers number at a billion and change. By far, this makes them the smallest generation in US history. This means that when it comes to politics, their votes are buried under the boomer generation on one side and the equally large millennial generation on the other, each of whom make up about a quarter of the US population as of 2016. In essence, they're a generation waiting to be leapfrogged by the millennials. On top of that, Gen Xers will be the first US generation to do worse financially than their parents. Which is odd because on one hand, they're the wealthiest generation, yet on the other hand, many are on the brink of poverty. Confusing, right? But consider this. According to a Pew Research report, Gen Xers earn far higher incomes than their boomer parents on average, but only enjoy a third of the wealth. This is partly because of the higher debt levels Gen Xers experience due to an explosion in education and housing costs. For example, between 1977 and 1997, the median student loan debt climbed from $2,000 to $15,000. Meanwhile, 60% of Gen Xers carry credit card balances month to month. The other big factor limiting Gen X wealth was the 2009 financial crisis. It erased nearly half of their investment in retirement holdings. In fact, a 2004 study found that only 65% of Gen Xers have anything saved for their retirement, and over 40% of those only have less than $50,000 in savings. Given all these points, combined with the fact that Gen Xers are expected to live far longer than the boomer generation, it seems likely that most will continue to work well into their golden years, really out of necessity. Worse, many Gen Xers are facing another decade, 2015 to 2025, of stunted career and wage progression. Since the 2009 financial crisis is keeping boomers in the labor market longer, all while ambitious millennials are leapfrogging ahead of Gen Xers into positions of power. The faint silver lining that Gen Xers can look forward to is that, unlike boomers who are retiring in less than a decade after the financial crisis crippled their retirement fund, these Gen Xers have at least another 20 to 40 years of extended wage earning potential to rebuild their retirement fund and deleverage their debts. Moreover, once the boomers finally do leave the workforce, Gen Xers will become the top dogs, enjoying a level of job security for decades that millennial and centennial workforces behind them can only dream of. This is why, even with all the chips stacked against them, you'd be a fool to bet against Gen Xers. In fact, the next decade will see Gen Xers seize their brief moment of demographic advantage in a way that could permanently tip their generational balance of power. By the mid-2020s, the Gen X political takeover will begin worldwide. What this means is that politicians from the boomer generation will either retire or be voted out of office, thereby creating openings for the Gen Xers, the next most qualified generation, to take their place. Once in power, the Gen Xers will gradually reshape their governments to better reflect their values of tolerance, security, and stability. And in so doing, they'll push for a radically new and pragmatic ideological agenda based on a kind of socially progressive fiscal conservatism. In practice, this ideology will promote two traditionally opposing political philosophies. On one hand, it will actively promote balanced budgets and a pay-as-you-go mentality. But on the other hand, it will also try to enact big government redistribution policies that aim to balance the ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. All in all, given their unique set of values, their disdain for the current politics as usual, and their economic insecurity, Gen X politics will likely favor political initiatives that include some of the following: ending any remaining institutional discrimination based on gender, race, and sexual orientation; a multi-party political system instead of the duopoly currently seen in the US and other nations; publicly funded elections; aggressively closing tax loopholes and tax havens that benefit corporations and the 1%; a more progressive tax system that more evenly distributes tax benefits instead of funneling tax income from the young to the elderly, i.e., ending the institutionalized social welfare Ponzi scheme. Other initiatives can include taxing carbon emissions to fairly price the use of a country's natural resources, thereby allowing the capitalist system to naturally favor environmentally friendly businesses and processes; actively shrinking the public sector workforce by integrating Silicon Valley tech to automate huge swaths of government processes; and finally, making the majority of government data publicly available in an easily accessible format for the public to scrutinize and build upon, especially at the municipal level. All of these political initiatives are actively being discussed today, but none are anywhere close to becoming law due to the vested interests that divide today's politics into increasingly polarized left versus right-wing camps. But once future Gen X governments take power and form governments that combine the strengths of both camps, only then will policies like these become politically tenable. And that brings us to the last point we wanted to cover in this podcast. What are the future trends, technologies, and challenges where Gen Xers will show leadership once they're in power? To get some fresh insight for this question, we called up our first guest.
My name is Darren Harnett. I am a futurist, consultant, and educator, and I am the president of Harnett Foresight.
To start, Darren shared with us some of his thoughts about Gen Xers.
The Gen X's are an interesting group in that there's quite a mix. If you look at the range from the earliest to the latest, there's a significant difference there just in the oldest and youngest with Gen X group. The older ones are still trying to keep up with their Gen X older siblings and the people they grew up with, in that they're focused on owning and attaining status, wealth, all that sort of thing, where the younger ones are closer, of course, as you would expect, to the millennials, where they're not as concerned with those things. This creates an interesting dynamic where there are significant differences within a single generation. So even though you have groups that are all classified as Gen Xers, they still disagree on many things. The other issue they have is trying to meet the needs of the large aging baby boom population, as well as the millennials coming behind them. Both groups are bigger than the Gen Xers and have more political and economic power. So while the Gen Xers have their own priorities that they would like to fulfill, they're often pulled in different directions by the larger groups on each side of them.
So we have a generation that's divided between competing priorities and divided on how to compete with the generations on either side of them. We asked Darren to share his thoughts about some of the challenges he thinks Gen Xers will be the first to tackle once they're in control.
The Gen Xers will be the first to have to deal with significant technological unemployment. As robotics and artificial intelligence take bigger and bigger pieces of the job market, they will have to come up with solutions, whether it's through some sort of income redistribution or just new and novel ways to create more jobs that we haven't thought of yet. Some of the other challenges are they will be among the first to have to deal with some of the major medical developments, such as gene editing and stem cell therapies that are happening now. And they will have to make decisions along with or in place of their aging parents. So when someone is senile and close to the end of their lives, do you spend the money or the effort on some of these treatments that could give them some extra life, but possibly not at the quality that they would like? The other big thing that they will have to deal with is the financial situation that is left. The baby boomers have created a financial structure that pays out a lot of what we call social programs, but the taxation system is not going to be enough to support it. Well, it hasn't been. That's why we're in so much debt. And that debt is not sustainable. And we're reaching a tipping point very soon that the baby boomers are going to have to fix. So they will have to come up with some very creative financial solutions to figure out how to fund the extended lives of the aging baby boomers, while at the same time living within the means of the population as a whole.
Significant technological unemployment, gene editing and stem cell therapies, deciding on how the boomer generation will live in their final years, and re-engineering our world's current financial system. Through all these points, Darren shared some interesting forecasts about what Gen Xers can look forward to over the coming 2 decades. And for better or worse, Gen Xers will be the first generation to truly tackle these challenges head-on. Some other points that Darren didn't mention, however, is that when Gen Xers fully replace all levels of government by the early 2030s, advanced climate change will be well underway. In other words, they'll enter power right when severe climate events and record-breaking seasonal temperatures will become the norm. This will force Gen X-led governments around the world to double down on renewable energy investments, as well as climate adaptation investments for their infrastructure. Next, as Darren hinted at, the robotic automation of a range of blue and white-collar professions will begin to accelerate, leading to massive layoffs across a range of industries. By the mid-2030s, the chronically high levels of unemployment will force governments all over the world to consider a modern New Deal, likely in the form of a universal basic income, a topic we'll cover in a later episode. Likewise, as the demands for the labor market change ever more regularly due to the growing automation of work, the need to retrain for new types of professions and entirely new industries will grow in step. This means individuals will become burdened with constantly growing levels of student loan debt just to keep their skills up to date with growing demands. Obviously, this scenario is unsustainable, and that's why Gen X governments will increasingly make higher education free to all citizens. Meanwhile, as the boomers retire out of the workforce in droves, particularly in the Western countries, they'll retire into a public social security pension system that's set to go broke. Some Gen X governments will print money to cover the shortfall, whereas others will completely reform Social Security as we know it. On the tech front, the Gen X governments will see the release of the first true quantum computer. This is an innovation that will represent a breakthrough in computing power, one that will process a range of massive database queries and complex simulations in minutes that would have otherwise taken years to complete. The downside is that the same processing power will also be used by enemy states and criminal elements to crack any online password in existence. In other words, the online security systems that protect our financial, military, and government institutions will become obsolete nearly overnight. And until adequate quantum encryption is developed to counteract this quantum computing power, many sensitive services now available online, like the entire e-commerce industry, may be forced to temporarily close their online offerings. Finally, for the Gen X governments of oil-producing countries, they'll be forced to transition into a post-oil economy in response to a permanently decreasing global demand for oil. Why? Because by the 2030s, car-sharing services composed of massive fleets of self-driving cars will reduce the total number of vehicles on the road. Meanwhile, electric cars will become cheaper to buy and maintain than standard combustion vehicles, and the percentage of electricity generated by burning oil and other fossil fuels will rapidly be replaced by renewable energy sources. All in all, these trends and many more mean that future Gen Xers will reign over a world that will struggle with extreme wealth inequality, technological revolution, and environmental instability. Luckily, given their long history with sudden change and an aversion to insecurity of any kind, this generation may also be the best position to face these challenges head-on and make a positive and stabilizing difference for future generations. So what do you think? What role will Gen Xers play in shaping our society, business, and politics over the next 2 decades? Send us your thoughts at feedback@quantumrun.com. We'll share the most thoughtful feedback on our website. Or post a comment in one of our Future of Human Population articles now published on our website. We go into way more detail about this topic there, and the links to all of these articles are listed in the podcast description below. A special thanks goes to our guest Darren Harnett for sharing his thoughts on Generation X. As for the music you heard throughout this podcast, it was composed by Karl Gutowski. Finally, want to support the show? Then be sure to subscribe, like, heart, share, review, and recommend this podcast to your friends. The more support we get from fans like you, the more often we can publish new episodes. It really does help. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcasts, Quantum Run on One and Quantum Run Soundbites, for more great insights on future trends. That's it for now, but be sure to join us for another episode of Life in 2030.